Look around you. Look at your life in this very instant. You probably feel that time is slipping through your fingers, that the days dissolve at a frightening speed, and that little by little you are becoming invisible. We were taught to see old age as if it were a sentence, a mistake of nature, a slow descent into irrelevance, where everything bright fades and all that remains is to wait for the end in silence. We live terrified of that moment, trying to outrun our own shadow, accumulating things, people, and memories as if we could build a useless barricade against time. But what if everything you've been told is false? What if we have been looking at the whole picture upside down? There is a possibility, a truth both dark and luminous at once, that growing older is not about losing anything, but about gaining everything. What would happen if I told you that old age is not a prison, but the master key to escape the cage you have been locked in since your 20s? Think about how you lived when you were younger. Remember the noise, that relentless mental noise, that constant static in your head that never allowed you peace. You were always running towards something or running away from something, always trying to become someone. You lived trapped in perpetual anxiety, worried about what others thought of you, measuring your worth against invisible standards that shifted each time you believed you had reached them. There was a brutal urgency in every single day. You had to prove you were worthy. You had to build a career, form a family, leave a mark, secure a legacy, and beneath all that frantic movement, there pulsed a silent terror. The fear that if you stopped, even for a second, you would discover that you were actually nobody. So, you didn't stop. You kept adding layers to that thing you called me. More achievements, more responsibilities, more labels: father, mother, employee, boss, friend, citizen, model. You wore those roles like heavy coats in the middle of summer, believing that if you put on enough of them, you would finally feel safe, complete, and protected. But it never quite worked, did it? No matter how many layers you added, there was always that emptiness in your stomach, that suspicion that something was missing, that the finish line kept moving every time you got close. You ran exhausted, wondering when you would finally be given permission to rest. What no one tells you is that old age is permission. And I'm not talking about the rest of death. I'm talking about the rest of being alive, but done with the illusion. The rest of not having to prove anything to anyone, not even to yourself. Simply arriving here already sets you apart from the rest. Most people prefer to drown themselves in noise because silence terrifies them. That is why I want you to leave your mark and show that strength that almost everyone lacks. Write in the comments, "I choose my peace." Let it not be empty words, but the first real step toward accepting that your own company is all you truly need. Now, let's continue. When you grow older, something fascinating happens. A phenomenon almost biological. Those layers you spent decades building and maintaining with such effort begin to fall away. Not because you are failing or declining, but because you simply no longer have the energy to sustain the illusion. And more importantly, you no longer have the interest. You look back at all that enormous effort you invested in being impressive, in being important, and you ask yourself, what for? Who was all that performance for? You retire, and suddenly you are no longer your job or your title. Your children grow, they leave, they build their own lives, and you are no longer primarily the protector who must watch over them every second. Your friends drift away, old routines dissolve, and one by one, all those roles you believed were your identity disappear. If you cling to them, if you desperately try to maintain control, this feels like an absolute tragedy. You feel as if your life is being stolen, as if you are vanishing from the map. But I ask you to shift your perspective right now. What if you are not disappearing? What if, for the first time, you are finally appearing? What if all those roles were only masks? Heavy disguises that you can now, at last, remove to discover who has been wearing them all this time. Just you. Not the important you, not the busy you, not the version everyone depends on to fix their problems. Simply that awareness that remains there, breathing quietly, watching the light enter through the window and settle across the floor. That is what has always been present. That is what endures when everything else collapses. And although it may sound strange to a mind conditioned by constant productivity, that is precisely the taste of true peace, as Alan Watts might suggest when pointing beyond the restless ego into the silent core of being itself. But here is where the deepest fear emerges, the silent adversary that waits in the night. Let us speak about being alone, because society has drilled into us the idea that aging is equal to loneliness, to isolation, to being forgotten in a dark corner while the world continues to spin with intensity. And yes, it is true, painfully true, that as you grow older, the crowd begins to fade away. The social world that was once loud and demanding slowly becomes quiet. Yet there is a vast difference you must understand, a precise distinction that separates suffering from liberation. Being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. They are not even close. Painful loneliness, the kind that gnaws at your bones, is a form of hunger. It is reaching out your hand in the darkness and finding no one there. It is longing for connection and having it denied. It is the sensation of standing outside of life, looking in through a fogged glass. But there exists another kind of solitude, one that is fertile, powerful, and necessary. This solitude appears when you stop reaching outward because you realize there is no need to do so. It is the raw and beautiful discovery that you are already whole, that you do not require anyone to validate you, to observe you, or to confirm your existence in order to be real. Examine it carefully when you are with others, even with those you deeply love. There is always an exchange, a subtle and exhausting dance. They need something from you, and you need something from them. You are performing. You become the friend who listens, the elder who advises, the presence that prevents the other from feeling alone. You are fulfilling a role, and that is natural. It is human, yet it is still work. There is a constant effort, a part of you that remains active, watching how you are perceived, adjusting your behavior to fit into a pattern shaped by the collective psyche. In true solitude, all of that dissolves. The mechanism comes to rest. You do not have to be anything for anyone. You do not need to maintain any fixed version of yourself. You can simply exist without witnesses and without judgment. You can sit in a chair for an hour, watching dust drift through a beam of sunlight, and no one is there to question why you are wasting time. You can think unusual thoughts, feel emotions without names, move slowly or not move at all. There is no audience. There is a wild freedom in that, a physical relief from the constant tension of being observed. This is not to say that relationships are not valuable. They are extraordinary, but they are far from being the only source of meaning. In old age, when life naturally begins to guide you towards solitude, you are given the rare opportunity to discover something deeply valuable, that you are, in fact, remarkable company for yourself. You have lived enough to carry thoughts that are rich and layered. You have seen enough to recognize beauty in places that once passed unnoticed. You no longer require someone else to point at the evening sky and confirm that it is beautiful for it to feel real. You can experience it directly, absorbing it fully, without filters or witnesses. This kind of inner sufficiency is something the young seldom grasp, not because it is beyond them, but because they are too absorbed in seeking their reflection in the perception of others. They depend on someone to witness their joy or validate their pain in order to believe in its existence. But you have remained here long enough to understand that your life holds reality in itself, regardless of who observes it. Tea still carries its warmth and taste, even when you drink it alone. The morning air still fills your lungs, even when there is no one to comment on its freshness. Your existence unfolds in its entirety, independently of attention. And once this realization takes root, solitude ceases to be a lurking fear and instead becomes a sacred space. From a Jungian perspective, this is the movement toward individuation, the process where the self no longer fragments itself for approval, but integrates into wholeness. Alan Watts might suggest that in this stage, the illusion of separateness dissolves, and what remains is direct participation in life as it is, without the need for commentary or applause. This leads to another profound shift, one that subtly reshapes your entire perception of reality as you age, the disappearance of the imaginary audience. In youth, much of life is performed before an invisible crowd. There is a constant urge to make moments count, to shape them into something worth telling. You go places not only to be there, but to later declare that you were there. You act not purely for the action itself, but for the identity it constructs. It is as if a silent camera follows you endlessly. You taste something delightful and immediately think of who you might tell. You witness something beautiful and feel compelled to capture it, to share it, to hear someone affirm, "Yes, it is beautiful. You have good taste." Even your most private pleasures carry the faint echo of wishing they were known. This creates a subtle exhaustion because it keeps you from ever being fully present. You are always slightly removed, translating your life into a narrative as it happens. But with age, if you allow it, this imagined audience fades away. The camera disappears, not because people stop mattering, but because you no longer depend on their acknowledgement. You release the need for every experience to be validated, observed, or transformed into something impressive. And in that release, life becomes astonishingly simple, immediate, and real. You can drink a cup of coffee and simply drink it. There is no need to wonder if it is the finest in the city or if it reflects a refined identity. You taste it. You feel the warmth of the cup resting in your hands. You watch the steam rise and dissolve into nothing. That is all. That is the complete experience, and it is enough. You can walk without assigning purpose to the walk. It is not exercise nor reflection. It is just walking. You feel your feet meet the ground. You hear sounds without needing to define them. There is a depth of appreciation in this state that is nearly inaccessible when you are preoccupied with becoming someone. Life does not need to accumulate meaning beyond itself. A moment holds value simply because you are alive to encounter it. The taste of bread, the touch of wind, the quiet rhythm of rain. These moments don't need to belong to any grand narrative of success. They are not leading you anywhere. They are simply unfolding, and you are present within them. That is the hidden essence, the quiet joy, not the rush of excitement, not fleeting pleasure, but the steady fulfillment of being, of recognizing your own existence. As Alan Watts would echo through a Jungian lens, this is the psyche at rest within itself, no longer chasing illusions of becoming, but embracing the wholeness of what already is. You sit in your garden and feel a deep contentment, not because you achieved anything that day, but because the moment, as it stands, is complete. No one is watching, no one knows. You are not turning it into a future memory. You are simply there, and that is absolute freedom. The freedom to experience life without external justification. Yet to arrive at this state, there is one final barrier to dissolve, a psychological threshold that binds you to unnecessary suffering. It is the most subtle of all because it disguises itself as morality and virtue. Expectations. This is where much of human suffering resides, especially later in life. We carry invisible burdens of shoulds. Your children should call more often. They should remember what you gave them. Your body should function as it did decades ago. Your friends should remain close. Your life should be resolved. Should. This is a quiet form of violence against reality. It is the constant measurement of what is against what you believe ought to be. That gap between reality and expectation is where bitterness grows. You sit with your grandchild, yet part of your mind whispers that they should visit more often. So the real moment, the one unfolding before you, becomes tainted by resentment over moments that never happened. You eat alone, yet compare it to dinners from 30 years ago when the house was full and alive. You cannot taste the food or embrace the silence because you are mourning what no longer exists. It is a trap constructed by the ego, one you step into repeatedly. Expectations are not reflections of the world. They are projections of how you wish the world to behave. And those projections separate you from your authentic life. Your real life is what is happening now. Your children visit as they do. Your body moves as it moves. This is reality. And you have only two choices. You can spend your remaining years arguing with what is, insisting it is wrong, living in constant resistance and disappointment. Or you can surrender and understand this clearly, not as defeat or weakness, but as an act of profound awareness and courage. In the language of Carl Jung, this surrender is the integration of the self, the dissolution of illusion, the acceptance of the psyche in its totality. Aging offers the gift of lucid exhaustion. You have been disappointed enough times to recognize the pattern. Things rarely unfolded as you intended. People did not behave as you expected. Life moved according to its own rhythm, indifferent to your demands. And gradually, through sheer fatigue, you begin to see it. Your expectations have never been in control of anything. They have only tightened the knot of suffering within you. And so, slowly, almost without effort, you begin to release them, not through rigid discipline, not through some heroic act of will, but because you are simply too exhausted to keep arguing with reality. There comes a moment when the psyche can no longer sustain the illusion that life must obey its demands. In that moment, something in you softens, and in that softening, in that quiet surrender of control, an unexpected peace emerges. Not the fragile peace that depends on getting what you want, but a deeper, more grounded peace, the kind that arises when the inner conflict dissolves, when you are no longer at war with what is. This is the beginning of a transformation that thinkers like Carl Jung explored in the depths of the human psyche, and that voices like Alan Watts expressed in a more fluid, experiential way. It is the realization that suffering is not born from life itself, but from the resistance we build against it. If your daughter visits only once a month, then that is what is. And within that simple fact, a new possibility appears. When she arrives, you are no longer distracted by the silent accounting of her absence. You are present. You listen, not as someone measuring time, but as someone receiving a moment that will never exist again. You look into her eyes without the shadow of, "It should be more." And in that presence, there is a quiet fullness that expectation could never provide. If your knees ache, then they ache. But even here, something shifts. Your awareness moves away from what has been lost and settles gently into what remains. Each step you can still take becomes something almost sacred. You are no longer mourning the mountains you will not climb, because you are finally aware of the ground beneath your feet. This is not resignation. It is a radical reorientation of consciousness. You begin to see, perhaps for the first time, that your expectations were never allies. They were projections of an ego trying to impose order on the vast, uncontrollable flow of life. And without them, something extraordinary happens. You become available to reality as it is. Each moment arrives fresh, untouched by the residue of how it should have been. Each interaction is no longer filtered through disappointment or anticipation. It simply is. There is a lightness in this, almost as if a great weight has quietly slipped from your shoulders. You are not happy because everything is finally going your way. You are at peace because you have stopped insisting that it must. This is your life. These are your days. This is your body. You can spend your remaining energy wishing it were different, or you can spend it inhabiting it fully. And life, especially in its later phases, will present this choice to you again and again until, at some point, you no longer choose struggle. And then you arrive at something deeper, something that has been waiting beneath all the roles you once believed defined you. Because, for most of your life, you thought you were the roles, the engineer, the mother, the provider, the strong one, the one who solves, the one who holds everything together. Society reinforced this illusion. It told you your worth was measured by your function, by your productivity, by your usefulness within the machinery of the collective. But now, those roles begin to fall away. The world no longer calls upon you in the same way. The structure that once gave you identity loosens its grip. And in that quiet space, a question emerges, simple, unsettling, unavoidable. If I am not these roles, then what am I? This question is not a problem to solve. It is a doorway. And what you begin to discover is something both humbling and liberating. You were never those roles. They were temporary formations, masks worn by the ego, necessary for a time, but never the essence of what you are. You are something far more subtle and far more vast. You are the awareness in which all those roles appeared. When you were a child, running freely, feeling the wind against your face, there was an awareness present, quietly experiencing it all. When your heart was broken in youth and the world seemed to collapse, that same awareness was there, holding the intensity of that pain. When stress consumed you in the middle years, when responsibilities felt overwhelming, again, that awareness remained unchanged, witnessing the storm. And now, as you sit here, hearing or reading these words, that same presence is here. It has not aged. It has not accumulated the years the body has. It has no wrinkles, no history in the way the mind understands history. It is the same silent witness, looking through different phases of life as though they were changing landscapes. What remains when everything else begins to fade, is not emptiness in the sense of absence. It is emptiness in the sense described by depth psychology and echoed in the insights of Alan Watts. A spaciousness, an openness, a pure field of being. And perhaps the most profound realization is this: that awareness you call yourself is not separate from the world around you. The boundary you once believed existed between you and everything else begins to dissolve. You are not an isolated entity trapped inside a body, struggling against an external universe. You are an expression of the same process that moves the wind, that grows the trees, that ignites the stars. The life that lives the universe is the same life that lives you. You are not a separate being having an experience. You are the totality expressing itself through this particular form, this particular story, this particular moment. And when this is seen not as an idea, but as a direct recognition, loneliness loses its foundation. You may still sit alone in a quiet room. The external conditions may not change, but inwardly, something is different. There is a sense of being held, of belonging to something immeasurable. You no longer feel like an accident. You feel like a necessary note in a vast, unfolding symphony. A tree does not justify its existence. A river does not earn its right to flow. They simply are. And, in the same way, you are. A tree does not justify its existence. A river does not earn its right to flow. They simply are. And in the same way, you are. And what is not asking you to be different. It is not demanding that you return to what you were. It is not measuring your worth against what you can produce. As you are now slower, quieter, more reflective, you are entirely valid, entirely natural. You are home. What you once called aging is not a mistake, not a failure, not even a decline in the way the ego fears. It is a transition, a phase in which life gradually releases its demands upon you. It is the moment when you are allowed, perhaps for the first time, to exist without justification. The lines on your face are not flaws. They are inscriptions of lived experience. Evidence that you were here, that you felt deeply, that you endured both the weight and the beauty of existence. The slowing of your body is not weakness. It is an invitation to notice what was invisible when you were rushing to inhabit time differently. The silence that now fills your days is not emptiness as lack. It is space. Space to breathe, space to observe, space to simply be, without the constant noise of becoming. You are not less than you were. You are different. And different does not mean diminished. The person you are now is complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because you lived, you loved, you lost, you acted with the understanding you had at each moment. And now, there is nothing left to prove. This is not the rest that comes from giving up. It is the rest that comes when the struggle ends. You are enough. You always were. And the time that remains, whether it is long or brief, is not a countdown toward nothingness. It is still life. It is still experience. It is still the unfolding of moments that can be met with awareness. There is still the light changing in the afternoon, the quiet warmth of a cup of tea, the distant sound of birds marking the passage of time. These are not small things. They are life itself, stripped of unnecessary drama, revealed in its simplest and most intimate form. Value was never dependent on intensity. A quiet afternoon holds the same depth as a grand adventure when it is fully seen. And perhaps this gentle, unassuming presence is what you have been searching for all along, without ever knowing how to name it. So now, there is nothing left to chase. Rest. Let go of the fight. Let go of the need to be remembered, to be important in the eyes of others, to leave behind something that proves you were here. You do not need proof. Just be here. In this body, in this life, listen to the silence that is no longer empty. Feel the peace that does not depend on circumstances. You are home, you always have been. And life, the universe, whatever name you give to this totality, is not asking anything more from you than this simple, profound presence. And here you are, present, alive, and already enough.